Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
Hello, everybody. I'm Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist, and this is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get better through education, stories, relationships, all the good things. And back by popular demand, I've got Dr. Lisa Diamond. You've been one of my most popular listens, by the way, on the podcast because you're so amazing and awesome. So there you go. I love your eyeball.
I'll take that. It's a Monday.
Yes,
I'll
you take
anything.
You take it. Yes, today is July 17th of 2023, and we are planning on discussing some new research that was released in May of this year by Dr. Tyler Lefevor and some of his colleagues out of Utah State University. And the research article is called "The Impact of Changes in Religion on Health Among Sexual Minority Mormons." This has been an area of interest, of course, for me. This is my background is Mormonism, and it's obviously an area of interest for Lisa as well, since she is a professor at the University of Utah and has done a lot of her own research on these kinds of issues. We are here to discuss it because here's kind of our main problem with this article, or at least how it's being kind of presented, is that some of the things that are coming out of it are this idea that sexual minority Mormons, and I'm kind of just putting this right out of the abstract, I'm quoting this, say that they report decreased psychological and social religiousness, which we tend to agree with. So people are not being very accepted. If you're a sexual minority in a high demand religion, you don't find a whole lot of acceptance around that. So people are leaving churches where they're not able to be authentic or able to be themselves or able to be accepted. At the same time, this also says having a religious community or religious relationship with your church is related to higher levels of meaning in life and lower levels of depression. And so therefore, people who are leaving the church, including sexual minorities, are reporting higher levels of depression and lower levels of meaning in life. So we're going to try to put this into context today through our podcast. And actually, we hopefully plan to have a conversation with Dr. Lefevor himself someday, maybe on podcast as well. So we're excited to maybe give him that invite. But what our main concern is, and what we want to talk about, is that when this kind of research comes out and these kinds of statements are made, we well know, living in the community that we do, that it's often weaponized. It's weaponized. Like, see, why would you leave the church? You're going to be depressed. You're not going to have meaning in life. You're going to be worse off. So stay in the church, even though we also know that staying in spaces where you're not allowed to be your authentic self also has high levels of mental health symptomology and chronic kind of issues that come from that as well. So here we are to focus on the classic things that happen with research, which is causation and correlation being interwoven in ways that are not always appropriate. So yeah, that's my little intro. Lisa, what do you want to say for a little intro as far as what you've been thinking about?
I also want to, make clear that the way little abstracts and summaries of research never quite convey the, complexity of the full research. And so, we're not going to dig so much into the nitty gritty of this finding. And I think, we can have Tyler on to talk about it. But about when studies like this are done, and when we talk about categories like staying in the church, leaving the church, that it's really easy to boil that down into kind of very simplistic ways of understanding things that often don't give voice to the full complexity. And so, the kind of boilerplate version of this, leaving the church equals lower meaning and higher depression. Boom, there you go. If you want to be less depressed and have meaning in life, stay in the church, even if you're gay, bye-bye. And in reality, of course, those categories, staying in the church, leaving the church, what do we actually mean by that? And that's where some of the differences, I think, between the social functions of a religious tradition like the LDS tradition versus the sort of doctrinal functions are really important. That when you are leaving a church like Mormonism, when you're becoming less religiously active in such a socially enmeshed culture as LDS culture, you're not just changing a kind of religious practice. It's not like, Methodism, like, oh, I don't go to church. You are leaving an interconnected social fabric that for a lot of folks, especially here in Utah, is infused in every aspect of their life. And when that is working for you, it feels like a social fabric, like a cloak that you can take everywhere that protects you from fear and from, existential dread. And when you are leaving a religion like Mormonism, you're not just changing your beliefs, you are stepping from a protective social fabric to literally like walking naked in the cold. You are giving up what our brains treat as fundamental, which is social connection to others. And eventually, research shows that people rebuild a different social fabric, but that takes time. And in this study, it was I think a 2-year follow-up. And, I started going through the literature, looking at other narratives of people leaving religious traditions and the sort of existential crisis that happens. And most folks said it took way longer than that to create a new support structure and a new kind of life structure. And the other thing I think that makes Mormonism different is that the truth claims are such an important part, and bearing your testimony, and that when you are leaving that tradition, you are basically turning your brain inside out, that everything you thought was true about gender, about the hereafter, about eternal families, that everything that you have literally been drinking in and maybe has been one of your strongest sources of sustenance, all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a second, am I, what? And that is an existential crisis, par excellence. And there's a lot of research showing that going through that kind of shift in worldview will temporarily feel worse. It'll feel worse before it gets better. And I think it's similar to people leaving other intimate relationships that don't serve them, bad marriages, dysfunctional family circumstances. When you leave, it doesn't necessarily feel better because you're giving up everything you knew and starting over again. And so that complexity isn't adequately captured by a quantitative, increase in depressive symptoms, because, I imagine that, a qualitative interview would reveal that for some of these folks, it's not just, oh, the church didn't like my sexuality and I left the church and I'm feeling worse. It's what is the meaning of life? What's the meaning? What is my goal? What's my purpose? Individuals who are raised in the LDS church grow up with a strong sense of purpose. And that purpose usually revolves around marriage and childbearing and, eternal families. And to walk away from such a clear sense of purpose and to be looking forward to the next 50, 60 years of your life being like, I have to find my purpose. I have to create it or make it, or what? That is terrifying. And, maybe one of the take-home messages from this article is how important it is for communities to take care of folks who are exiting, high demand religious traditions in the same way that we take care of folks leaving dysfunctional family relationships. We say, okay, you're going to need another family for a while. Let's take care of you. I think we need to do the same thing. And I think the queer community sometimes doesn't do a great job with that, of saying you're in a transitional space, you're going to need family. You're going to need a chosen family to get you through this transition.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I've been working with faith transitioners for most of my career, right? Almost 25 years now, which is crazy to say. And it's so interesting when I hear somebody who's, either coming to my counseling or coming to one of my groups and saying something like, it's been a whole year. I've been at this for such a long time. And I'm like, oh, you're a faith transition baby. Right? Like a year is nothing. And yes, you're correct. This study was a 2-year longitudinal study, and it was about 350 people, about half of which they were able to follow longitudinally. So there is, in my anecdotal kind of experience, it's typically 3 to 5 years where I see people really going from that, that pendulum shift of like being a true believer to kind of going, on the other side of the pendulum, and all the things that happen with that, which are very normal, I don't always love that word, but kind of very normative or common things to go through, which is like anger and betrayal and doubt and self-doubt and wondering whether or not I made the right choice. And then also feeling the intense levels of kind of societal implications as they leave from their family and from their friends, and all of those people's worry and sadness and disappointment and, all that pressure to kind of come back to the fold, which is usually well-intentioned and yet causes this very, very deep distress, for people who are not necessarily celebrated as they leave, right? Usually in most religions, and especially in high demand religions, we celebrate people when they join us, when they come forward, they come in, we have a baptism and we're all throwing a party and we, have food and we welcome you to the congregation, and it's all this fellowship language. But if people choose a different path, we don't have a similar way of saying, well, we're going to miss you. We wish you would stay, but good for you for finding a new path, and we're going to celebrate you regardless. That's not really what culturally happens. And so to your
it's like even worse than that. It's like, it's not just that you're not celebrated, you're ashamed and you are judged. And I can't remember whose quote this was, but there was some researcher who said that, the definition of a cult is something that where you're not allowed to leave with your dignity intact. And so the process of exiting is not like, oh, you're just searching for a different path. Okay, brother, join you on your journey. It's, oh my God. And so there is no way to step outside the church without kind of walking through, kind of walking on hot coals on your way out. And that's going to have an effect, that's going to leave some scars on you, that it's not just that you're not celebrated, you're actively judged. The other thing I think that's interesting in terms of the amount of time it takes is that, there's so much in religious practice that is based on certain rituals that happen at a certain time of year. And so a part of the leaving process for a lot of folks is the first Christmas, the first things, my first birthday, my mother, and this and that. And the only kind of cure for the experience of loss that you have that first year of adjustment is repetition and making of a new pattern. So it may not be until you have 3 or 4 Christmases under your belt without the church that you say, I have a reality of Christmas. I have a reality of these holidays or these moments, or I have a memory and a lived experience outside of that faith tradition. When you're so close to it that all your memories of all the important parts of your life are infused with that, then all you can experience is loss. The only context you have is, I don't have that and I don't have that, but you don't have anything to replace it with. And time really does heal. I mean, time and actually gathering, oh yeah, I had this experience, and that birthday I was with my friends, and I didn't have that awkward feeling about my gender, and but that will have its effect, but it takes time. And if you're talking about having spent, 30 years in a religious tradition, it's going to take a little longer than 2 years to rebuild.
Yeah. Yeah, to your point, I mean, it's not just not being celebrated. It's a sense, in a way, it's a form of shunning. You're seen as a sinner, or as somebody who has lost your way, or as somebody who is, not prioritizing morality. There's
For being selfish.
or being selfish, and it's very difficult when you're used to feeling part of a group to then be ostracized by that same group. Feel disrespected, right? Feel like, oh yeah, I'm not being respected at the same way that when I was in the group. So now I'm being treated as less than, as other. That just can create a lot of sadness. And especially when it's your family, when it's your loved ones, it's the people that you've spent your whole life with that now feel this way about you. And even more so when you're a sexual and gender minority, right? If those are the reasons why you're leaving the church, it's very difficult. I want to just kind of right off the bat say, when we're talking about Mormonism, or when we're talking about religion isn't like a static, like one bucket type of thing. So that's why I usually like to say high demand religions, or conservative religions, or even fundamental religions, which all tend to have a much higher cost of leaving them. There's less of that ability to let live, or even much less celebrate people's paths when they go a different way. That's not so much the case when you're talking about more progressive religions. And of course, there are a lot of religions that are very accepting and affirming of gender minorities, of sexual minorities. So we want to be careful that we're not just lumping religion, quote unquote, into one category.
I think, high demand religions often are also shame-based religious traditions, in which the essential badness of human nature is a fundamental tenet. And therefore the function of the religion is to draw you away from your intrinsic badness and toward goodness. And so in a tradition like that, a step away from the religion and toward your personal kind of fulfillment is defined as just like antithetical to just everything good in life. Because if you define the self as worthy of shame and as needing to be controlled, then stepping out is just like, yeah, you're going straight to hell. And that is definitely not the view of all religions. But in shame-based religions, there is no way to make a choice for your personal happiness that is not defined as just inherently degrading and debased, because their view of the natural self is that you're degraded and debased without some sort of religious guidance.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, to your point, there is always a worsening when people leave a community. And that's even not just necessarily religion. There's immigration, issues when people leave their countries or their families, from a different country. There's, even when you change a job, even positive change. I remember learning this way back in Marriage and Family Therapy 101, is that positive change creates stress. And so even when you get a promotion, or when you have a move that you're looking forward to, or you get married, or you start a new partnership, all of those things that we deem as positive are still stressful. They still require us to shift in some ways from the prior comfort level we were in. And
if the prior comfort level was partly comfortable because you didn't have to make any decisions, because all you had to do was follow the prophet. Like, life is complicated. Life is confusing. Life is like, how do you know what's the right decision? If you've spent, the first half of your life and part of your adulthood internalizing you don't ever have to wrestle with those hard decisions, because all you need to do is listen to us. We will tell you the right thing, and you can go to bed every single night knowing that as long as you are obeying, you are on the right path. There's a lot of reassurance to that. And so to go from that, where you literally have not even exercised the pathways in your brain that say, what should I do to be happy? And all of a sudden you're faced with that question. And it's like you're given the library of the world, and you're like, choose. And you have no history of having made choices like that. You have no history of doing anything other than following. How are you even supposed to know kind of, what to do? I remember reading a memoir by a woman who left an FLDS group, and she talked about how she couldn't tell what kind of clothes she liked. She couldn't tell how she wanted to wear her hair. She's like, I had no experience tuning in to my authentic voice and saying, what do I feel like wearing? And she's like, it took a while to even learn how to make decisions about what I wanted. And I think we can't underestimate the degree to which, for Mormonism, trusting in the prophet and trusting in the elders is such a big emphasis that you don't get a lot of practice in agency and autonomy. And agency and autonomy kind of suck in some ways, because you can make a lot. It's hard to make decisions. It's hard to figure out your life. How do you it's one of the reasons that people like religion. Just tell me how to be happy.
Yeah, tell me what to do. Tell me how to make moral choices. Tell me how I should live my life, right? So there is a very, again, normative aspect of this. And again, why self-doubt is such a huge part of these changes. It's very common to miss or want to go back to a more innocent or structured space where these things were kind of taken care of. And again, that all has to do with meaning of life. Everything you've just been speaking about has to do with meaning in life. What is my life about? And I remember in the 80s, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they came out with a video, that was all about meaning of life. And they asked all these existential questions, which are at the base of almost any religious organization or foundation, which is like, why am I here? What am I doing? Why is there suffering in the world, right? Like, where am I going to go next? And so Mormonism, as well as many other religions, does a pretty good job of answering all those questions for you. And so, yes, if you're letting that go, that's a big part of what I see in my clinical practice, is people saying, but what about the reassurance I had that I would see my family again? What does happen after this life? What does death mean? What am I doing here now that I'm not working towards the celestial kind of glory? What am I working towards? What's the purpose of the times when I do struggle and when I am sad and when I am depressed? Like, even in these high demand religions, oftentimes there's not a lot of space for feelings. And I think in Mormonism in particular, we have the plan of happiness, which, there's a lot of positive aspects of that. At the same time, there's kind of this pressure to be happy. And I saw this in evangelical Wichita too. It's like, well, if we've got the Lord on our side, you shouldn't really be sad or angry or upset about anything. Even when somebody dies, you're kind of expected to just have these kind of short quips that are supposed to comfort you. Well, they're in a better place.
They're with the Savior now.
Right. So all of those feelings of grief or desperation are not really even allowed to be expressed, within the community. So to your point, it's agency, it's all those things. And it's just like learning how to be human in a very different framework, right? When people are leaving.
One of the things that is occurring to me hearing you talk about that and the sort of, there's that happy valley stereotype of, Mormonism. It's like this kind of false smiles. And that's true in a lot of traditions, not so much with Orthodox Judaism. They tend to embrace the despair of life a little bit more. And I think that has something to do with, the historical context of Judaism. But I do think that one of the things that humans are so bad at is is sitting with negative feelings and just allowing them to be and not trying to change them, escape them, run away from them, just feeling the hardness of life and feeling the suffering and feeling the loss and saying, all of this is real and I will survive this feeling. You know, I can just sit and feel it for 5 minutes and not be like, no, focus on the positive, focus on, no. It's like, you know, yes, the part of what I think people who are leaving Mormonism are experiencing is this thing of like, yeah, there is suffering. There's terribleness all around me. And I have no confidence that the good things that occur to me are because of anything I'm doing. And therefore the bad things are also not avoidable. That life is that uncertain and life is that hard. And that, like, there are plenty of people who through their whole lives are struggling to just accept that. And what religion often does is it allows us a way to exit out of that realization or have a, you know, a context. And for some individuals that can be really affirming. And I don't want to, you know, convey that anyone who's religious is like in denial. People have a lot of different ways to make meaning out of suffering. But I think one of the things that, you know, I think a lot of clinical, you know, therapists would argue with their clients is that, but first just feel what you're feeling. Like, let's just first get comfortable. Yes, you lost something. You lost a lot, you know, and will things get better? Hopefully. But have you experienced loss? Yeah. And it's okay to absolutely feel that feeling. And you don't have to run away from it or reframe it or sing through it. You could just be like, I have lost a really important connection. And I know why I did it, but it doesn't change that feeling. And I can survive that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that kind of, I always have a hard time knowing how to suss this out, but all of these studies, for the most part, as far as I can tell, unless there's studies where you're actually like measuring something physiological, they're self-report studies. Mm-hmm. And so I, you know, having been through, I mean, I'm 51, I'm not necessarily that old yet, but I'm getting there in life experience. and
I'm 52. I know so much more than you.
Than me.
That 1 year gave me a lot.
Well, and having had the experience of being quite religious and then going through faith transition issues of my own and then being excommunicated and all those kinds of things, I understand how I would have answered a question 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and today, right? And all of those are very different ways that I would have talked about my faith, my religion, my mental health, my well-being, my status within the community, my meaning of life, right? All of those things I would have shifted in how maybe I would have answered some of those questions. And I just can't help but think, and this is where I struggle because I don't want to tell people what they should be thinking or feeling, right? Yeah. At the same time, I want to put into play this idea that we have I don't think anybody escapes internalized shame.
No.
Internalized shame, right? And when we talk about internalized, what that word means is that it's not always conscious. We're not always consciously aware of how we've been shamed and how that shame affects our day-to-day perspectives and lives and how we make decisions and how we interact with other people. And so when I think about people who grew up in my particular faith tradition, there isn't really a lot of allowance, again, to consider yourself not happy, not doing well, because you have the gospel, right? You have the gospel of Jesus Christ. You have the best gift that ever could be given. So you have to kind of explain away these negative feelings, kind of like you're saying. So I have a deep distrust, just me personally, for research in general.
I love this
in general because I'm very evidence-based, right?
But I totally share this and I collect this data. So and here's my thing, you know, these self-report measures, and I use these depression scales, and they're well validated, blah 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 blah. But here's the problem, and it's an impossible confound, and I don't know how to deal with it. One of the kind of features of the LDS tradition is this kind of distrusting your own instincts and looking to, your bishop and to Heavenly Father, that your internal experience is mediated, by, some representative of God. And you're not really given permission to look inward and feel what you're feeling. You've got to distrust what you're feeling, and then wait for the angels to tell you kind of what you should do. So therefore, when you are answering a self-report question that says something like, how many times over the past month have you been so down in the dumps that nothing could cheer you up? That's asking you to go inside yourself and articulate a really bad feeling, so down in the dumps that nothing could cheer you up. And if you have been raised in the church, a feeling like that, to be that sad, it says something bad about you. It's like you, and so if you feel that and you're still actively in the tradition, then the part of you that distrusts your interior experience is going to come in and say that it can't. No, that's not a strongly agree. That's going to be neither agree nor disagree, right? So the meaning making process happens already. And I think that when you give scales like that to a non-religious population, they're kind of, it's not like you can't trust the results when they come from religious populations. But when you are using a self-report measure that's using narrative language, how often have you felt like nothing you did, what was going your way? That's another kind of the items on this scale. That is, for a Mormon population, those are different types of questions. They're loaded questions, and they trigger certain self-protective, shame-protective responses. That it's not necessarily that it means that we can't believe the results, but we have to understand that the meaning-making process also applies to filling out questionnaires. And the problem is, I'm not sure how we get around that. It's the nature of self-report data. I would love to see a study that uses some of the implicit measures that are used actually to assess racism and sexism and things like that, where instead of asking people, like, do you think that, white people are better than black people, blah, blah, they do these reaction time tasks where they just present you like certain words and you categorize them. And what they're focusing on is the speed at which you respond to information that fits with your implicit beliefs versus information that contradicts your implicit beliefs. And so if you, and I'm gonna exaggerate this just for clarity, if you're shown the word black and bad, and you have to decide, are those two categories alike or not alike? And you might say, oh, black isn't bad, black is good. If you actually are kind of a white supremacist and you think blacks are bad, it will take longer for you to say, oh, black isn't bad. Like when you are going against an implicit belief, it takes longer at the level of milliseconds, right? You're not consciously aware of that. And those studies have found that you can get a little closer to the architecture of the way you think about things. And I'm not aware of studies that have tried to look at kind of implicit measures of depression. I don't even know if they exist, but I do know that this problem about narrative items on self-report measures. How would you rate your level of happiness? How would you rate your sexual satisfaction? There's a big problem with sexual satisfaction because, a lot of folks will be like, how's my sexual satisfaction? It's great, right? It's great. It's great. It's great. Yeah, great. It's totally great. And it's like, what does that mean? What do you like compared to
How are you
what?
even defining that? How are you defining sexual satisfaction, right? This is even how do we define health, right? So like because studies kind of consistently come out saying that people in religion are doing healthier, doing better. Okay, but with what? And what does that mean? And how much of that is really just a community protective factor, right? Regardless of what the beliefs and dogma are, right? And so these are all the things that I'm constantly kind of thinking about when
I mean, the other analogy that I sometimes think about are, parents who have lost a child. And often they, obviously that is an unbelievable, unfathomable loss. And some of them manage to reframe it into purpose, right? Like, oh, it was gun violence that took my child, or it was drug abuse. And it is when they rebuild a reality in which that loss has meaning and they create a new purpose, then they can begin to thrive. It doesn't mean that the loss doesn't exist, but that search for meaning and purpose, is that a human need? Absolutely, yes. And if religion was your meaning and purpose, then you're gonna have to create a new one. And it can take a while to, do that. Some individuals will find it through work. Some individuals will find it through a new family structure. But meaning that is authentic has to be built. You can't get it off a shelf. And it may take a while to refashion the meaning and purpose that is going to get you through.
I love that. Meaning has to be built, not taken off a shelf. That's a great quote.
I mean, think of how often we kind of sell, and it's like, I think about this with all this crazy self-help large group, like people are like, just tell me, just give me the thing, give me the thing that will make it all make sense. Take this 8-week program, read this one book. It's like, there literally is no shortcut to meaning, in the same way there's no shortcut to education, right? The reason that credentialing programs take so long is, sorry, knowledge is never fast, neither is meaning. There is no substitute for sitting with the existential quandaries of life, that suffering happens, that loss is real, that things don't make sense, the things that, a lot of missionaries discover when they go, they're like, oh my God, the world is terrible. Like the world is on fire. What are we doing? That's real. And the only way through it is to actually sit and think and rebuild it brick by brick by brick by brick. But when you build it yourself, it is so much more stable than if you just receive what was given to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll complicate that a little bit, because I don't know that any of us are islands where we just build anything by ourselves, but we have more diversity, right? When we leave a small group, or even when you leave your family, I mean, this is part of emerging adulthood, right? When you leave your family structure, when you leave maybe your church community, or when you're expanding on those things, you don't necessarily leave them, but you're expanding. That's when you have more diversity of influence, of thought, of ideas, right? Because all of these things that we're building come from something and somebody. Usually, what's the saying? There's no unique idea anymore, right? Like somebody has thought it. So I think that's really important, which kind of goes to what we were talking about even right before we got on this interview. You said, it has to get worse until it gets better. And I think this is what we're really trying to throw out there today, you and I, right? It's like, let's not be so scared. Like we see research like, oh, you're going to be depressed. You're going to lose meaning of life if you leave the church. It's kind of like Rapunzel in the tower, right? It's like, if you leave the tower, life is going to be so bad. And really a lot of that, what that's serving is the people who are, your caretakers, right? Your mothers, your fathers. Yeah, just having that, that other people's anxieties are oftentimes what's keeping you in that tower, right? Because they're like, no, don't leave. The world is scary. Sometimes it is, like I said, well-intentioned, like parents want to be protective, or church leaders want to be protective, or teachers want to be protective, and say, don't do it this way. And yet going out, bruising your knees, figuring it out, getting different perspectives, all of that is actually very helpful in authentic living and figuring out what's going to work best for you. And we're not very good at that. We're not very good at letting people suffer, like you're saying.
That's so true. That's so true. And I was listening to it was a YouTube clip. It was Anderson Cooper interviewing Stephen Colbert about, they had both had significant family losses in their life. Anderson Cooper's brother committed suicide when he was relatively young, I think in his teens. And Stephen Colbert lost his father and his two brothers in a plane crash when he was 10 years old.
Wow.
This is some significant trauma. And, and Stephen Colbert's talked about how he had to learn how to love that terrible thing that happened to him. And Anderson Cooper, in a really authentic way, was like, oh, really? Like, all right. Do you actually believe that? And Stephen Colbert, said with such sincerity, yes, if you love life, you love all of it. And that the bad parts are a part of what make you who you are. And you have to, it's not to say that it's easy, but like you said, this distrust of suffering or like, oh, I don't want, it's like, no, the best of you will probably emerge from really confronting the suffering and the pain and the loss. And like, without the church, without this, what is there? And to be able to tolerate that and say, well, I'm going to have to find, meaning and purpose and joy, that there is good that comes from that comes from a really honest confrontation with the worst and the hardest and the most inexplicable things of life. That if you can tolerate it, and if you have safety around you, if you can have people around you that say, yeah, that is awful, I'm with you in the awfulness of life, that's where the growth can come.
Right. And this goes right to the point of the whole research, is that it seems like the goal is to be happy, right? And even with my clients, I typically have a conversation about, is happiness really the goal? Is that the goal of life, right? Because if it is, I think you're going to be consistently failing at your goal. I prefer words like contentment or general satisfaction, right? But happiness is a feeling that may come and go 500 times during one given day, along with 500 other feelings, right, that may happen. And so I think we have this expectation that if you're doing well, and this is kind of prosperity gospel too, right? If you're doing well, if you're doing what God wants you to do, if you're paying your tithes, if you're reading your scriptures, if you're worshiping the way you're supposed to do, because I think earlier you said, you're getting judged as a person, but you're also getting judged as your worship is failing if you're not.
Yeah.
Right. So the way that you're showing up in these religious spaces are also kind of judged and deemed both by self and by others as inappropriate or not good enough if you're not happy, right? But so I think just shifting our goals to happiness being something we feel at times, along with many other feelings, and that then we can have a general contentment with life. So I think, even, so there was an article in the Salt Lake Tribune, I think an interview with Jana Riess, who interviewed Dr. Lefevor, and he's saying, he was surprised by these findings too, right? So he felt that as people become less religious, they're going to be happier. And that hasn't necessarily been what's been reported in a lot of these studies. But again, I'm not sure that should be the goal, right? But I think that's how it will be weaponized, because it's like, see, you're not happy. Instead of seeing that suffering, seeing that growth, seeing that shift is actually better wellness, especially in the long run for so many people. Now, again, some people will stay in religious communities for their entire lives and do fairly well there as well. There's no one right path to to living life, but I do get concerned when we're trying to measure happiness, like
Yeah.
it's the end all be all, when really isn't it more
Like,
of a well-rounded space that we want to be? Yeah.
it's also hard to, again, it's like, what is happiness? You could argue that to some degree, the type of happiness that is offered by a lot of high demand religious traditions is happiness through obedience, is like, it is to be happy to follow it, like that is the definition, and you don't have to look any further. So that black pit of fear that every human has as their birthright, don't worry, you don't even have to look at that. You stay on the surface of it. And one of the things that happens if you kind of change your worldview is you actually have to go into those deep, dark, existential fears. And I often, people talk about the examined or the unexamined life, and the unexamined life is not worth living, blah, blah, blah. There are individuals who are absolutely satisfied with not examining their life, with living a sort of level of a surface thing. And, I've had to learn to not be judgmental of that, because, a part of me is like, what. But that is a way to be. That is certainly a way to be. If you choose to puncture the egg yolk of existential despair and actually look at it, yeah, it's gonna suck for a while. So it's like, there are different ways to be happy. And, there's a concept in attachment security and attachment theory talks about how, kids who've gone through a lot of hardship and have had really inconsistent and not, very great caregivers, can they end up emotionally secure? Absolutely, but they have to earn it. And they talk about how earned security and the way that they measure this, and I think it's important given what we talked about, self-report, that body of research realized that just asking folks, were your parents loving and giving, was not going to get at it. And so the adult attachment interview is done in a way that you're asked to describe your parents, and then you're asked to give examples. And what they're looking for in those interviews is coherence, is an ability to make sense. Like, my mom did this, and that was really awful. And over the years, I've come to understand why. And, I can live with that and forgive her. That's really different from someone saying, oh, she was great. I'll give me an example of how she was great. She was just great all the time, just great. And that would be viewed as not coherent, because it's a pat kind of response. And so, if you want to get to the earned post-religious happiness, you can't skip the coherent part. You're gonna have to make sense of complicated things. Whereas staying in the tradition is some way staying on that bubble, like, it's great. It's great. I don't have to look at that. I can stay here. It's great. It's really great. That's one way to live a life. Another way is to break the yoke, go in, make sense of it, and come out the other end. But that process takes more time.
Yeah, no, exactly. And again, Dr. Lefevor says in this article,
Lefevor. I think you combined.
Sorry, Lefevor. Sorry. Thank you. He says, I think a lot about a survivorship bias in the data. Religion helps the people who have been able to stay engaged with religion. What we see in national data about sexual and gender minorities is that they're a lot less religious than cisgender and heterosexual folks. So I always add that grain of salt, that when gender minorities and sexual minorities continue to remain religious, it seems to benefit them. But a good chunk already left because it didn't work for them. So that's even just sharing, like, who are we who are we collecting the data from, which is another thing to consider. And even as I read that paragraph, I want to just be careful that we don't conflate religious with spiritual, because a lot of people who leave organized religion or leave certain organized religions will still seek spirituality, will seek maybe other religious communities or spiritual communities that feed that need for meaning of life, wellness, spirituality. You can have spirituality through humanism, through nature, through, you don't even need, a belief in a God, which is what the atheist and agnostic communities continue to remind us of. And you don't need religion to make you moral, right? So these are all kind of some of the myths that are baked into these internalized kind of ideas of who we are as people. So, and I think what's so tragic is I don't think gender and sexual minorities would leave religions if they were able to be their authentic selves.
Oh yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, the fact that these traditions, because I often think that what is really tragic is that it's only within, like, religion that often a lot of folks have a space where they're allowed and encouraged to put aside for the second all of the worldly concerns that we all have to have every day of the week, and you go to a space where people are talking about the deepest questions of being human, the deepest questions of love and commitment and family. And it's like, almost like we need that as humans. We need a way to separate ourselves from all of those everyday concerns and think about our souls and ourselves. That process doesn't have to come with a fancy doctrine. I mean, it's what some people are getting through therapy, for goodness sake, going to a place where their deepest questions are honored and taken seriously. So I think that's a deep human need. It doesn't have to come with a weird set of sexual and gender rules, but the way that religions have developed in the Western world tends to do that. And what a lot of people want when they go to church is coming together with individuals, thinking about the state of their souls, thinking about how to do good, thinking about how to connect to others. And they have to get that sandwich with a big fat layer of rotting shame on it. And it's like, I can't have all of that wonderful connection about the meaning of life. I can't get that without the shame. Like, the shame comes with it. It's like, sorry, you're in for a penny, in for a pound. And so I absolutely think you're right. If there was a way to connect over transcendent experiences and, a connection to the earth and to time and to history, which is a big part of all traditions, if you can get that without the shame, I think that absolutely, sexual and gender diverse communities would be like, I'm all in for, like, existential deep meaning, without the shame attached. And it's interesting because that's what a lot of Reconstructionist Judaism tries to sort of do. And my wife and I are kind of on and off parts of the Reconstructionist Jewish community here in Salt Lake. And that, when I've asked her about it, like, what is it, where does this fit in your cosmology? And for her, so much of the connection is about people, it's about family, it's about the songs, it's about the practices, it's about being a Jew and being connected to history. And there is no part of that that requires that you add shame to it. That is something humans do. And I know that there have been a lot of folks, in the ex-Mormon community who have said, like, why can't we be more like Jews? Can we just have, like, a cultural form where we can sing the songs and remember our families and not have that shame sandwich? Unfortunately, I think for some religious traditions, shame is baked so deeply into the doctrine that you just can't get it. You can't get it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in talking about shame, I'd like to finish up our interview with kind of some of his thoughts. Again, Dr. Lefevor's thoughts about his own experience, right? So he says, I was a really active Latter-day Saint until I was 25. I loved the church and it worked for me because it provided meaning and belonging and a framework. exactly everything we've been talking about. I was 13 when I knew I was different and I didn't have good language for it. So I told my dad I liked men's bodies, and it was really kind of embarrassing and shameful. And then I took that back for the next decade, really, which again is very common. This is a very common story. I didn't identify as gay. Of course, the church doesn't allow you to identify as gay. I saw it as a thing that happened to me sometimes, but not as a consistent internal experience. I think that let me do a mission and engage in the church in a non-harmful way. And then in my early to mid 20s, I hit a place where I needed to do these relational milestones expected in the faith, and it didn't work so well. I'm guessing what he means is marrying a woman, right? And having babies. At that point, the church became a source of stress, and it remained a source of stress until I resigned after maybe 6 years. I resigned because I determined that marrying a man was going to be the most happiness promoting path for me. Now I experience the church as harmful. If I sit through a church service at an LDS church, I feel defensive, like I am harmed or attacked by it in a way that I didn't when I was in the church. My thinking has shifted so much. So this is like life experience, aging, living, and how certain things at certain times can be good enough or play a role, and then you grow out of it. And this is kind of, I think, the dilemma of being a human, is that we're doing this in all ways as we evolve. I think the reason why your podcast was so popular is was the evolution of sexuality. And I think it really is causing people to think that, yeah, we don't just come into the world, figure out our development by 17 and then stick to a path and all is well until our 90s when we die. Like every decade has its own developmental features, has its own evolution of who we are and what we've lived and what we've experienced.
And that's going to be true for spirituality as well.
Exactly.
And we know that some sexual minorities who leave the church go back in for a while and then they go in and out, and it's almost like humans are just struggling to find the peace that we want. And leaving the church and staying in the church are both trade-offs. You're going to get something, you're going to lose something, and the balance of that trade-off may change at different points in your life. If you have a community outside the church, and in some of the work that we did, the biggest predictor of like being okay with leaving was having something else, was having, a lot of social safety outside the church. So if you have that, you're probably going to be doing better. If you don't, then maybe staying in the church for the social contact is going to be the trade-off that works best for you. And I think that folks that are wrestling with this decision are like, should I stay? Should I go? As if there's one answer. I think a lot of people could kind of reduce their own anxiety if they just accept that from moment to moment, those trade-offs may change, like that it's a moving target. What is the best, what's the best way I can be happy right now? And that might change in 2 months, and it might change in 2 years, and it might change in 5 years. But to be realizing that, yeah, you're going to have to keep deciding and keep asking yourself, what do I want? Where is my joy? Where is my sorrow? What do I have around me? And that, for queer folks, they may spend time going in and out until they find the trade-off that works for them in the moment they're in. And that doesn't mean that they don't know what they're doing, and it doesn't mean that they're undecided. It means that they're wrestling actively with the hardest things about life. And wrestling with it actively can be a really growth promoting process if you have support around you, if you're not doing it alone.
Yeah, you and I have been talking about shame for a long time. We're even thinking of podcasting about it. We're like so excited about shame. Are we excited about shame? We're excited about this.
It's a shame-demic.
That's right. That's right. So I think what we know, and just to kind of wrap things up, we know that shame is bad. It's not healthy. We don't have a lot of really good data to support shame, which is different than guilt, right? I do want to, there are things I think we should feel guilt for, especially when we treat other people shitty. But shame is this internalized idea that somehow who I am, what I want, where I find pleasure, where I find my authenticity is not okay. It's not okay with the systems that be, you know, whether that's patriarchy
And
or
it's essential to
capitalism.
remember that shame is always defined with respect to a group. You know, shame is a function of the social brain. You don't have shame in non-social species, right? Shame is how social species regulate behavior. Are you in or are you out? It's the hot stove of a social brain. Something about me is disgusting, is gonna disconnect, you know. So there's a lot of work saying that shame is simply the experience of existential disconnection, of pushing out. And so it's all about the group. It's all about who you're measuring yourself against. It's all about who is judging you. People don't get shame without a group.
Yeah. Which is the huge contraindication, because like shame is bad, group is good. Like we need group, we need community, we need people, we need a pack to belong to. And so you have that kind of contraindicated issue that's happening all the time.
Tribal. It's deeply, deeply tribal.
Basically, yes, you probably will struggle when you leave your church community. You will probably be depressed. You will probably lose a huge way of thinking about meaning in life. That is true. That doesn't mean that you should stay where you're at either, because that's also costing you something as well, especially if you're a gay and sexual minority in a high demand religion where you're being told on a fairly regular basis that you do not belong, that the way that you are needs to be changed to fit a more heteronormative, allonormative, imaginonormative perspective of how to live life. So that is also costing you huge. And so
also, I mean, the other aspect of that is that the happiness that you get that comes from obedience is a happiness that is always on the verge of being lost. It's like, it doesn't belong to you. All of your joy, all of your pleasure is like tenuous. You can lose it in a heartbeat. And one of the things that you hear from individuals who've gone through major pain and loss or left traditions is, oh, I reached, you know, yeah, it was hard, but the happiness I have now, or the peace I have now, I can't lose it. I can't lose it because it depends on me. And that is something that I think for individuals who've been raised in high demand traditions, they can't even imagine a form of pleasure and joy that can't be lost, because the whole way of socialization is everything depends on membership. And so every good thing is like, you got to be grasping for it because it doesn't belong to you. Your joy doesn't belong to you. And the transition to a life where you build with a community a joy that belongs to you is a fundamentally different experience and a longer lasting one. But yeah, it's like, if you build it, you're building something that you cannot lose. And that is something that you often hear from folks who've been through recovery or been through trauma, that all of it, you know, all of my happiness depended on everything else going one way. And now I have a happiness or a peace that lives inside of me that I can't lose.
exactly. That's exactly right. So, given all of that, we're hopeful that people will continue to strive for authenticity, strive for pleasure, strive for well-being, overall general well-being, and that includes wrestling with difficult emotions, difficult feelings, difficult aspects of life.
With other people.
Yeah, with other people. I was telling my kids, you know, life is wondrous and life is hard. Those two things are happening constantly, and that's okay. That is okay, and that is part of growth, and it's part of resilience making, and it's part of figuring out what's going to work. So, you know, I think that, you know, I've been through, you know, divorce and excommunication, moves, you know, leaving my family back when I was an emerging adult, all of those things came with great pain, great hardship, and they've all been really good for me. They've all been really, they've created, I'm very pleased with where I am today, even though I still experience stress and sadness and hardship, on a regular basis. And I think we could all say those things, whatever those things are. I just gave a little list of my life, but everybody could come up with a list of things that you've been through that maybe you wish wouldn't have happened, or even if you are happy they happened, they caused pain and hardship. And that is part of our growth and development and our evolution as a person who may live, several decades in this world. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Always fun.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. So thank you so much. And we will reconvene shortly, I'm sure, to talk more. I'm excited. Yeah. Have a great week, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon halls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the